Good afternoon and welcome to CRC for Developing Australia's second edition of our web newsletter and webinar series on broadacre cropping in Northern Australia. You may know the CRC's mission is to boost the economy and wellbeing of communities in Northern Australia, and for us, Northern Australia is that vast region basically north of the Tropic of Capricorn, covering northern Western Australia, all of the NG, and central Western and northern Queensland. CRC may achieve this through co-investing in industry-led research projects in agriculture, food, health service delivery, and traditional owner-led businesses in these fields. As part of this program, CRCNA has co-invested with GRDC and the Cotton Research Development Corporation in 5 cropping projects, which look to bring broadacre cropping diversification options to either pastoral or sugarcane dominated agricultural regions. These projects are all around the halfway stage of their life, and each take a different approach to investigating the introduction of a cropping system to existing grazing operations or the agronomic potential of new crops and varieties. Each Wednesday, over the next 5 weeks now, we will bring you a 30-minute webinar from one of our 5 projects, and a final 6th webinar where the collaborating farmers will provide their perspective on this cropping. Last week we heard from Daniel Rodriguez, and this week we're again in the Gilbert River region with Graham Harris from DAB. During these webinars, if there are any technical issues, please use the chat function and I'll endeavour to resolve that. But use the Q&A function to ask questions of the presenter, and these will be addressed in the second half of our webinar. These sessions are being recorded and will eventually be available on the CRCNA website. So let me introduce our second talk in the series, and this is around developing a broadacre cropping sector in northern Queensland, and Graham Harris from the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries will be presenting. Graham, I will get out of here and let you take over. Okay, you can start sharing, Graham.
Yes, have done so, Anne. I assume that's all coming through okay?
Fine this end?
Yep, that's great. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this second webinar in the series around the broadacre cropping projects that have been funded by CRCNA, GRDC, and obviously CRDC as well. I'm speaking on behalf of a project team comprising Dr. Lance Pendergast, Laurie Owens and Charlie Nastasi. Lance based in Townsville and Laurie Owens and Charlie based in Mareeba in North Queensland. I'll go to the next slide, that'll be good. Now, the aim of our project, developing a broadacre cropping sector in North Queensland, is to evaluate crop options and practices that can be used to develop profitable cropping systems within the region. Specifically, we're looking at crops different than those that have been looked at by some other projects as well, so that there are some complementary between the various projects. The work that we're currently doing, funded through the CRCNA and GRDC, is follow-on work from 2 years of research that the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries funded at Georgetown on the Forest Home Station site. So we gave a little bit of an overview of what's happened at those sites over the years. So in 2018. Replicated trials were conducted on cotton, mung bean, sesame and soybean. And the photo and image you see here is an aerial view of the trial site from the 12th of April 2018. In 2019, the trial site was again planted to cotton, mung bean, sesame and soybean. These photos were all taken the 28th of March of 2019, and it gives you some idea of how the cotton, the mung bean, soys and sesame looked at that site. we did hold a field day that site where people were actually able to view those crops. And we'll be presenting some of the results of these later on in this presentation. In 2020, we shifted sites on Forest Home Station to a larger site, an 11-hectare site, where we were able to put enclosure fencing in to prevent problems with wallabies and pigs and the like. And this took a little bit of setting up. Of course, 2020 was a particularly difficult year. The wet season arrived late and was not particularly wet. So that has created some issues, which are probably reflected in the results that you'll see later on. The replicated site was planted there in 2020. We planted cotton. There were 3 Bollgard 3 varieties that were actually planted. 2 commercial mung bean varieties, Crystal and Jade. We had 6 sesame lines, 2 black types and 2 white types that were planted, and also 2 soybean varieties, Coranda and Mossman, were also planted in that year as well. So in 2020, this was the new trial site, showing some of the cotton there on the left. We've also got mung beans or soybeans, mung beans and sesame planted there, going from left to right. This was an aerial shot taken on the 12th of May of that year. But you can see by the surrounding environment just how dry it actually was that particular year. There's not a lot of green growth happening outside of the trial site area itself. So this is some images of some of the crops in that particular site during 2020. There was a cotton there, all photographed the 16th of April. The cotton there was at 54 days after sowing, the mung beans at 43 days, and sesame at 63 days. The soybeans we'll talk about a little bit later on. That is an image taken from one of our on-site cameras. We had some significant issues with soybean establishment. In fact, the soybeans failed to establish after 2 plantings in 2020. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. So let's talk a little bit about yields. We'll focus primarily on yield at this stage. Obviously, some quality characteristics are also being assessed. But the results I'm showing here are for the 3 cotton varieties, which we have again planted this year. So we have some good data for the range of Bollgard 3 varieties that have been planted. You'll see there is also a regulant treatment that has been applied in the 2019 and 2020 years. But I guess the key message here to look at is the sort of yield potentials that we are achieving. We're achieving yields across the 3 seasons ranging from around that 8 to 12 bales per hectare. The 2020 year was a particularly difficult year, lack of moisture. And one of the challenges at our site is that we've been using a furrow irrigation system on sandy loam soils, which are not really well suited to furrow irrigation, better suited to overhead irrigation. However, these soils are particularly representative of the 20,000 hectares of potential irrigated cropping country that is available on in the Etheridge Shire, on the Gilbert and Ainsley. It's important to see how crops perform both in an irrigated and a dryland sense. And in some of our years, we have actually done some dryland cropping work as well. But essentially, in the better seasons, we've achieved yields up around that 9 to 12 bales per hectare, as you can see across the site. We'll talk a little bit about mung bean yields. Mung beans, we planted commercial varieties in 2018 and again in 2020. We also planted some mung bean lines, which are not yet commercial, in 2019. We've opted this year to continue with planting commercially available varieties to look at their performance. I guess the key message here is a range in performance of yields ranging from around about that 1 tonne per hectare at its worst up to about 2.5 tonne per hectare. In 2018, we achieved very good yields of Crystal and J, which are very similar varieties anyway. And that gives us some indication of the sorts of yield potentials we can achieve. Some of the other mung bean lines showed a similar range, ranging from about 1.4 up to about 2.4 tonne a hectare. So there's certainly good potential for mung beans in this environment as part of the cropping system. And we can talk a little bit about that later on. Soybeans have been an interesting crop. We planted the crop in 2018 and again in 2019. 2018, the varieties planted were those available at that time, the A6875 and Stewart, irrigated, of course. Yield potentials around that 3 to 4 tonne was, averaging out around 3.5 tonne a hectare. In 2019, we looked at Coriander and Mossman as probably better adapted varieties to this region. We looked at the irrigated and dry, at both varieties in an irrigated and dryland context. You can see the benefit of irrigation in 2019 was clearly evident, with yields around the 2 to 1.5 tonne per hectare for the dryland cropping in that season, but irrigated yields exceeding 3.5 tonne per hectare. One of the challenges that we have found with soybeans, in 2020, we planted soybeans and we had a failure of establishment. The replant also failed to establish. And it appears as if we have some challenges with relatively shallow planting and hot conditions when it's trying to emerge, cooking the seed. That is a challenge for us, because with our furrow irrigated cropping system, we're unable to flush up the soybeans. That's where an overhead irrigation system would be preferable. We have a similar situation occurring this year with our first planting of soybeans, which also failed for the same reason. However, our second planting, which fortunately received follow-up rainfall after planting, has established. So we have been able to successfully establish soybeans this year. But again, I guess the key message here is, irrigated yields in excess of 3 to 4 tonne a hectare do seem quite possible. Sesame is a crop that we are also investigating and have done so over a number of years. In 2018 and 2019, we looked at a number of lines. In 2018, we were looking at white-seeded lines, non-shattering types. In 2019, we looked again at white-seeded and black-seeded types. The yields are ranging around about that 1.6 to 2.5 tonne a hectare. That's reasonably consistent with yields achieved in mechanised production in the United States. Again, this is fairly early days with Sesame. There are a number of particular challenges which have to be addressed, which we will discuss as well. This particular year, in 2020, we attempted to plant Sesame again, and we ran into similar issues with establishment as we had with soybeans. So poor early rainfall prevented us getting the site fully prepared in controlling weeds prior to establishment. So weed competition became a major issue in the trial site in 2020. That is a significant issue for crops that are not particularly competitive, and Sesame is one of those that has a very poor weed competition capacity in the first 35 to 40 days of establishment. So 2021, we've again planted the replicated site at Forest Home Station. We put cotton in, again, those same 3 varieties as we have over the last 3 years. Mung beans this year, we've opted for 4 commercial varieties which have a range of growth patterns. Jade, of course, Solera, 2 Opal and Onyx. We've again planted Sesame, 2 black types and 2 white types. And we've increased the number of soybeans to 3 varieties. We've got Coranda, Mossman and Hayman. Hayman is more suited to a high forage production type variety as well. So we're investigating it this year as well. The planting itself, this is the current status. We planted our first sesame planting on the 17th of December. That was impacted quite heavily by strong weed competition as a result of the rainfall events which started happening just prior to Christmas of 2020. And post-planting rain was quite significant there. A second planting at a separate site within the trial was made on the 21st of January, and that planting is progressing quite well. Cotton was planted the 28th of January this year. Soybeans, again, we had the issue of, we attempted to establish soybeans the 15th of January. Again, poor establishment resulted from seed cooking through hot conditions immediately after planting and prior to establishment. And the replant, which was made on the 9th of February, has established well. Mung beans have only just been planted on the 4th of March, and they're going very well at the moment as well also. One thing that we're looking at this year, in addition to the different crops and the varieties of those crops, is we're actually looking at herbicide options. There is currently some work funded through AgriFutures, which is funding a range of projects around sesame. One of those project areas is around weed control, and the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, through Michael Widrick and his team, are actually assessing potential herbicide options in a glasshouse context. We're looking at some of the more promising options and evaluating them in a field context to see what implications there may actually be in terms of crop safety, but also effectiveness on the particular weeds that we have. Black pigweed's one of the major weed problems that we have at this particular site, but we also have a number of legume species weeds which are causing. So Centro is a bit of a problem for us at that particular site at the moment. This is a view of the trial site. You can't see the cotton. It's at the lower below where this image was taken. The area that's cultivated there is, this was taken, this image, on the 4th of March. That area is being finally prepped up for planting to mung beans. Soybeans immediately to the north of the cultivation area there, and the sesame plantings are next above those. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the site itself. And of course, you'll see the Gilbert has got some water in it at this particular point in time, which was a bit better than what we were looking at last year. Just some learnings. I guess the key learnings that we've actually had this year around cotton, I guess over the 4 years, cotton is obviously well adapted. We do have a range of good weed control options available in cotton, but we do need to think about how we're going to manage our reliance on glyphosate. Obviously, weed resistance, herbicide resistance, is going to be a major challenge if we rely on a single strategy for managing weeds. And weeds are an important thing to manage properly in this environment. Mung beans are also well adapted. We do have some good weed control options there with mung beans, but again, we need to be ensuring we get good establishment and we do actually have effective weed control strategies. and we need to be on top of insect management as well. We've had some aphid issues in mung beans, but generally speaking, other insect pressures have not been a significant issue for us. Fall armyworm, for example, have not been an issue for us in these crops, but I guess they have other options, maize, particularly in sorghum in the district, which is probably what they're concentrating on primarily. So, but yes, we do need to be aware of potential insect, weed and disease of things that might actually happen in the future. In terms of soybeans, we clearly have some challenges around the establishment of soybeans. That needs to be investigated more fully, and I think some of the challenges because we've not been able to flush up the soybean crops using furrow irrigation on those sandy loam soils. So that the lack of suitability to furrow irrigation is not unexpected on that soil type. This is something that we need to think about longer term in terms of irrigation development, where probably overhead systems are going to be better adapted to this environment than the furrow irrigation in those particular soil types. Sesame, an interesting crop. It has a long way to go. There are some establishment challenges. It's small seeded. Its main issue is around its very poor early competitiveness with weeds. The first 35, 40 days, it is a very non-competitive plant with weeds, and so we do need to look at having clean seed beds wherever possible, and looking at options, obviously herbicide options, but there will also need to be some other mechanical options being considered as well too, and how we might deal with sesame. A lot of agronomy needs to be developed around the growing of sesame in the longer term. And yes, there are some other projects that are looking at sesame, and you may hear some mention of those in later webinars in this series. So look forward to hearing a little bit more about that into the future. I'd just like to acknowledge the funding support of the CRC Northern Australia and also the GRDC. In addition, over the years, the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries has been investing into cropping research into the region. I'd also like to thank the State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning Department for some of the funding that they provided to us to enable the establishment of the second trial site they have on Forest Home. Their funding enabled us to do the fencing that's there. Of course, we must be particularly thankful for the support that Ken and Brendan Fry from Forest Home Station have provided us over the years. We've been there 4 years now. They've been particularly helpful and supportive of the work that's going on there, and hopefully one of them will be available in the producer session that we held at the end of this series to talk a little bit about what their experiences have actually been. So we can't thank them enough for the efforts that they've put in as well. It's been much appreciated. And as the leader of the Broadacre Farming Systems team within DAF, I'd like to particularly thank my team of Lance Pendergast, Laurie Owens and Charlie Nasasi. Work at this trial site is challenging because of the distances involved and the effort that needs to go into remote sites. They've been doing a sterling job there and will continue to be doing so into the future. It is our intention that we will have we hope to have a field day, a farm walk field day in May at the site. I do know that the Etheridge Shire Council, based out of Georgetown, are intending to run a broadacre cropping forum in the week after Easter. They will hear some of and get some opportunity to have a look at that site on a very short visit during that week. However, a more detailed look at that site is planned for later in May. So you'll hear more about that into the future. And I'd like to pull up there. Thanks very much, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Graham. If you see if we've got any questions coming through.
Okay.
None at present. I can
Right.
I can kick off with a couple anyway.
Thanks, Anne.
Weeds seem to be a very big issue. I mean, this is the third year of cropping on this site. If I understand that right. Are you seeing any?
Okay. Yeah, well, this particular site, this is the second year of cropping on at this particular site. So
Okay.
to give you a bit of background, the previous site had been cropped for a while and was less challenging from a weed perspective, but it was really fairly small site. So we were a bit limited in space. So we shifted to the current site I have on screen. I think you've got that there. You'll see that it was an area that had been grassed or pasture area, and we've actually converted it from pasture area into a cropping trial site. As a consequence, it's quite a bit of grass in that site, and also some issues with Centro. If you don't get good establishment with your crop, you will run into weed issues, and that's partly of what problem we see here. And I pulled up this site from 2020 because if you have a look, I assume you can see my mouse. If you have a look here, you've got the water runs from the lower part of the screen to the top part of the screen, and this is one of the furrow issue problems. Getting water to the end is a bit of a challenge. But you'll see in the cotton area that we've got some poorer growth and going on here, and some grass growth happening here as well too. That's because it's become more or less, in this particular year, it became a dryland site at the end of the field, really, more than an irrigated one. If you look in the crop adjoining, you'll see quite a lot of grass competition going on there. This is soybeans here, so that's a challenge. And then we have the mung beans over here. So they perform much better. But our biggest problem with the soybeans was poor crop establishment. The mung beans were good crop establishment. We had some weed options there, but really poor crop establishment is the challenge there in the soybeans. And sesame, we have very limited weed control options available to us in the sesame. So it is important to, if you're going into cropping, to get on top of the weeds, have some idea of the history of the site in terms of any herbicide residues you may be dealing with, but also think about what species that you're going to be dealing with as well. So, yeah.
So, Graham, do you see benefits in jumping straight from pasture or pasture use into cropping, or do you think there are some lead-up crops that you can do, which would, if you take a 2-year strategy of setting your site up to make control easier?
I think from our experience, and my feeling is that cotton is an ideal crop to use, particularly using the Bollgard ready and Roundup ready cottons. We do have an option of using glyphosate in that context. I do caution a complete reliance on that in the longer term is not going to be a good idea. But I do feel that cotton giving us the options we have available to us and the returns that we get from that, it is a very good crop in that context. I think in the longer term, we do obviously need to have a range of crops in the mix, and ideally you should have broadleaf and grass-based crops. So sorghum, corn potentially. Once we get on top of some of the other potential issues around fall armyworm will be of interest. Particular property on which we're operating here have grown both sorghum and corn in the past commercially and have done so quite successfully. But I do think we do need to think about the cropping system where we need to think about grass crops and broadleaf crops in combination. Legumes, of course, included in that mix.
We have one question about the sort of water use efficiency figures that are associated with the various crops being investigated, and whether budgeting for water, whether you have some idea of the ballpark figures of water required, and how different is that from southern systems?
Yeah, they're quite different in the sense that and I guess we do have those figures in 2019 and 2018. We had much better wet seasons, and in fact, the irrigation applied was about half to 1 megalitre per hectare, so virtually limited, not much at all. 2020, yeah, much more water are required in that year, but we're probably only looking in the order of, and I have to look back at the figures, I think it was only about 4 to 5 megalitres per hectare for the cotton in that particular year. That also, remember that yielded less that year too. So if we had been able to get more water onto it, we might have been able to get, might have been able to get higher yields as well too. This year, I guess one of the things we've seen in that environment is it does vary significantly from year to year. The amount of rain that falls varies significantly from year to year, and of course how it falls is also very significant challenge as well. One would expect that in this environment, we are going to achieve, in terms of irrigated water application, quite high water use efficiency or water productivity figures, if we can make best use of the rain that does fall when it actually falls. So I suspect that, it's interesting. This particular environment is not as hot as, say, for example, the Flinders Valley is, which is completely different. It has high humidity, but we're talking temperatures around the 37, 38, 39, and they're relatively, well, I'll say they're relatively mild compared to, say, the Flinders, where your temperatures in, say, Richmond, Julia Creek, those sort of areas are sort of around the 41, 42, 43, but it's a much drier heat down there too as well. So yes, it will be interesting to follow how these go. We have soil moisture probes in these sites, and we will be looking at that type of information. So we have a fairly good understanding of the environmental conditions the crops are experiencing, and also what water has been applied as well.
Thanks, Graham. Are there any other questions? We have come up to our 1:30 time. No one's jumping in with a final question. Thank you, Graham.
No problem.
Thank you for that webinar. We will go again next week, and next week we're introducing Pharmacist Pipes Limited, who have taken over the developing oilseed project based on the East Coast, and we'll hear from Nick Hill from Pharmacist, who will introduce us to the work they're doing, expanding the work that Tony Matchett begun and taking that down from Mackay, down to Mackay and Berkeley regions as well. Thank you for your attendance, and hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. Bye.